English translation, 721st Contact, Part 1. Friday, the 14th of June 2019, 21:48 hours.
And here we are. Was different again meeting us at the biotope, but what I want to show you I just did not take with me on my little walk. So look here, this is what I want to give you to read, which I am afraid I forgot when I gave you that little piece of Peter's work, but did not let you take it with you, which is why you photographed it with your device and wanted to duplicate it, as you said.
I did that too, and it would have to be duplicated several more times, because Florina and Njana and everyone else also asked if they could have a copy too.
Interesting, so you sort of advertised it then? But what does that mean, everyone?
Everyone who knows you and who is now also interested in your friend Peter and wants to know more about him, if he allows you to answer their questions. But advertising, as you say, I did not do that with it. I just made it for viewing about our...
Any channel, that's what you mean, isn't it?
Yes, that's what it was. Because the gift is a little piece of art that I also let Florina and Njana see, who were both in favor of me, including everyone else as well, so that they could also see the little piece of...
Understood, I can relate to that. But Peter really has to decide for himself whether I should share anything about him, because you know.
Of course, that's why I am asking if you can talk about it, but then it is done if permission is given, because more cannot be possible.
Then I will ask him. But tell me, you said that all my acquaintances want to have a duplicate copy of Peter's little marvel. That would be 60 persons together with Ishrish Asket and with your daughters Simyase and Plaja.
That is correct.
Good, I will ask Peter. But then something else. Could you look up in your father Svatha's annals what year it had been in the past when I was traveling with Svath in 1946 and brought the big Bible with me? Which I then used to pay for all the timber and the almost oats, which I then used to build out the 3 bedrooms, the kitchen, and the hall.
Yes, the year of the past was 1861, and the day was the 12th of April. This date was chosen by my father to remind you of the beginning of the American Civil War, or War of Secession, which took place with an attack on a garrison containing only a small garrison, which surrendered on the afternoon of the 13th of April, 1861, after being shelled and cannonaded for over 30 hours in a completely insane manner. The same day you returned to Switzerland, where you spent the afternoon with a priest called Morlin, whom my father had been contacting for some time and who then gave you the Bible.
I still have a vague memory of that. Of the garrison, among other things. Because Svath and I were traveling for several weeks at that time in different places and in several countries, as well as in different ages. Regarding the garrison you mentioned, I remember that it was on an island and also far outside a large town. What particularly amazed me at the time was that the garrison was surrounded by extraordinarily high brick walls, which, if I estimate them today, were certainly 10 meters high or even more. Also from above, looking down from the pear nave, the walls were very thick, maybe about 3 meters or so. On the wall were ancient guns, but I could not count their number. Svath said, when we were there, that the small garrison of the garrison had been besieged for several months or so alternately by 450–550 soldiers of the Confederate forces. The siege troops, I also remember, had gun emplacements around the area, which was actually a harbor. When Svath and I arrived there early in the morning, there was bad weather and a strong storm, but the garrison was nevertheless already being shelled, although the small number of soldiers in it did not fire back or defend themselves. Because, as Svath said, as I still remember, they were being shelled by the siege force with many guns and shells and prevented from using their own guns. As a result of the continuous bombardment, which we observed hovering high above the action for about 2 hours, being shielded from sight, large parts of the garrison were destroyed by thousands of cannon shells and grenades. And the following day the small garrison was forced to surrender, although there were no casualties in this heavy engagement, as Svath had later stated.
You have a good memory.
It goes like this. At that time Abraham Lincoln was President of the USA. who is the support for my memory in this matter, and who was shot by an actor in a theater in Washington exactly 4 years later, on the 14th of April, 1865. The killer had co-conspirators and was a fanatical supporter of slavery and the Confederates, because of whom the Civil War was fought, because they did not want to abolish slavery. But I can't remember the name of the killer. I've simply forgotten it, as well as the names of his cronies, which included a woman.
His name was John Wilkes Booth.
Yes, now that you mention it, I remember. He was then shot, yes, when he was going to be arrested, while his accomplice was hanged.
Which you, yes.
Ptah, excuse me, but we don't have to talk about that. You know all about what your father Svath taught me. All the things he made me see and often made me shiver, don't you?
Unfortunately, that is not the case, which is why I always read in his annals what has happened during the 11 years of your acquaintance. And when I alone consider all that I have learned so far from the records with regard to all that you experienced and learned together with my father alone during the World War period, I shudder and freeze. To this I must say, despite my age, that I alone would not have been able to cope with even a small part of it, even if I had been older than you were. Just reading it gave me the shivers.
Excuse me. I did not really want to talk about that, but to ask you what you actually got out of all that he taught me regarding the matter of your task of continuing the teaching and mission of Nocodemian. Your daughter Simyase, as well as you and Quetzal, have told me that you are well occupied with the teaching, and also knew that you are included in the lineage of the teaching of Nocodemian, and that you will therefore also be in contact with me. I know from Svat that he only informed you about everything in relation to the closer connections during the last years of his life. But I would now be interested if you could briefly explain to me some closer connections, such as with regard to your lineage back to Nocodemian, etc. Perhaps also some of your father's Svath annals?
The whole thing is rambling, so I will have to go into it in more depth at a later date. What I want to say today relates to the following. About the lineage of our family, which goes back to Nocodemian. It is to be said that my daughters Simyase and Pleja are relatives, which also include Quetzal, Asket, and Nera, and of course others, are in the obligation to preserve the teaching of Nocodemion, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life. This, however, is only the direct teaching, comprising 77 million canons, of which you have made out the OM. But apart from that, there are still many doctrinal parts which are of a completely different nature, as my father listed in his annals, but which were not accessible to him and are also not accessible to us. For this reason you had to retrieve information from the memory bank of Nocodemion for my father, which was important for him and also for us, and is also important for our future. What I am about to say, however, is not much, and the whole thing relates to the fact that our task of preserving the teachings goes back to a man of our very early ancestors from the line of Nocodemion. More specifically, to a very distant descendant of his 3 sons, whose name was Gilkar, note, meaning of name, the Rectifier, and who undertook to carry on the teaching. From his family line came the commitment of the transmission of the teachings into the farthest future, whereby the ancient teachings of Nocodemian are preserved and taught to this day, and also throughout our very extensive Plejaran Federation. Unfortunately, however, it has not been preserved in its entirety, but only in part, which is why my father Svath felt compelled to enlist the help of his father, grandfather and great-grandfather at an early stage in order to obtain more precise details and instructions for himself and our family regarding our task of preserving and passing on the teachings. He recorded the results of his research in this regard in his very extensive annals, which he himself, however, only gave me access to in the mid-1930s and informed me of the fundamental connections with the teaching of Nocodemian, as well as our family lineage and kinship and the task. So it was only then that we found out about the reincarnations of the spirit form of Nocodemion, namely that it also appeared in several reincarnations on Earth. The beginning of the spirit form of Nocodemion on Earth came about 389,000 years ago, when a Playaran herald from the Nocodemian lineage named Ijum, meaning of the name the Prudent One, came to Earth with 144,000 human beings from the Nocodemian people and settled in the Gobi Desert. However, the teaching that Ijum taught was disregarded, as has been the case since time immemorial and always, which is why there were always only a few who opened their ears to the efforts of the Annunciator. The majority of the masses, therefore, did not care for the teaching brought by the herald, but in their delusion of faith continued to follow their gods, which equally led to differences and disputes among the various faith groups, as has always been the case, even in later times, and has remained so to this day among all the delusional believers in religion on earth. At that time, however, after only a short time, the hostilities among the immigrants broke out to such an extent that the city built in the desert and the other populated areas, as well as the earth, had to be abandoned. More than 25,000 years ago, new Playaran immigrants arrived on Earth with a slightly yellowish skin pigmentation and mixed with already existing earthly human forms, resulting in another human species that migrated to a large island. The original immigrants, who came from our Ankar universe more than 25,000 years ago, had created a dimensional gateway millions of light years beyond the Milky Way galaxy, and so entered the Dern universe and from there to Earth, where they settled in fertile areas that are now all part of China. What happened about 389,000 years ago, after only a third of a century, then quickly led to the termination of the action and the abandonment of Earth, after which their distant descendants many generations later, about 13,500 years ago, once again formed an Earth immigrant community and came to Earth. These settled east and south in various places in the areas bordering the Mediterranean Sea and sought a new beginning. This, then, was after another ancient Pleiadian immigrant community had migrated and settled in the fertile lands of what is now called China, some 11,500 years earlier. When then, about 13,500 years ago, the up-to-then last Playaran community of immigrants came to Earth, then this happened in a completely secret form. Namely, because since the time of 389,000 years earlier, other extraterrestrials had come to the Earth in the meantime and had settled down far and wide on all continents, above all the long-skulled ones. In ancient Egypt in particular, they rose to positions of power, waged wars and subjugated tribes of peoples, such as those who called themselves Ebraya. It was these who, in later times, under the leadership of a Negrid Playaran descendant called Avian Note, meaning of name, he who gives refuge, who was, however, called Avram by the Ebraya, had joined forces about 4,500 years ago with the still few distant descendants of the ancient Playaran immigrants who appeared about 13,500 years ago, and also begat many descendants. From these descendants begotten between Playaran descendants and the Ebraya, a sixfold lineage of termination then emerged, namely from the reincarnation line of Nocodemion, whose spirit form reincarnated several times and in rapid succession among the Ebraya. This was after the then messenger Ijum from the Nocodemian line lost his life in the Gobi Desert during the warfare of the Earth immigrant community about 385,000 years ago, and his spirit form either remained in the earthly realm or migrated and returned, about which unfortunately nothing is known in detail. What is known to us, however, is that the old Playaran immigrants very quickly mixed with the above-mentioned tribes of peoples, but it turned out that this time, two unpleasant disputes arose, which led to the fact that, despite the efforts of the heralds, various of these peoples split up, and partly also fell into bondage to other peoples. However, when I speak of those peoples into which the Plejaren immigrants integrated themselves, I am not referring to large peoples, but to larger tribes of peoples that did not correspond to complex forms of social organization. The members of these tribes of peoples, which corresponded to a tribal ethnicity, traced back to a common ancestry, which ensured that a certain mutual cohesion was given as a result of kinship. This, however, did not prevent larger national peoples, who could no longer be called tribes of peoples, but real great peoples or state peoples, from forcibly binding smaller tribes of peoples into servitude. This was also partly the case with the tribes of peoples who had settled around the Mediterranean areas and had mixed with the Plejaren immigrants at an early stage, who were then forced into servitude in the land of the ruling long-skulled ones. But the same thing happened to the Ebrea not only by the rulers in ancient Egypt, but also to their distant descendants by the king of the New Babylonian Empire, Nabukaduri-Usurtu, who is also called Nebuchadnezzar II. The proto-tribal leader of the Ebrea was a very distant Negrid descendant of a Plejaren group who had appeared on Earth as immigrants more than 13,500 years ago, who had also mixed with Earth humans. This proto-tribal leader called Avian, living in a land area called Plecht, east of the Mediterranean, with a nomadic tribe of Ebrea who called him Avram. The denunciation by 6 heralds with the Noko-Demion spirit form took place after the Plejaren immigration on Earth some 13,500 years ago and lasted until the time of the year 632. The heralds were the following: Enoch, born the 3rd of February 894 before Emmanuel BC, Elia, born the 5th of February 891, 780 before Emmanuel BC, Yesaja, born the 7th of February 772, 690 before Emmanuel BC, Jeremiah, born the 9th of February 662, 580 before Emmanuel BC, Emmanuel, born the 3rd of February -2, 111, the 9th of May, Muhammad, born the 19th of February 571, 632 after Emmanuel AD. They all endeavored to teach the doctrine of Nocedemia not only among the Ebrea, but also among various peoples who existed in the regions bordering the Mediterranean to the east and south, as well as in Egypt and on both sides of the Red Sea down to its end. But they also taught far eastward to Mesopotamia, where King Gilgamesh formerly ruled in Uruk-Gart, as well as to the Aryan country. What I still want to explain for today, this refers to the fact that also in the sister creation, the teachings in the Tao universe are taught among the peoples who have migrated from our planets. So also among the people of Ishkrish Asket, as also among all sonar peoples. And the fact that we also brought this teaching to Earth at an early time was due to the fact that our ancestors discovered a natural dimensional gate 22 million years ago by chance, which is located here in the Dern universe about 120 light-years beyond the Pleiades stars known to you. The dimensional gateway was discovered because a moon from our anchor universe that had drifted from an exploded planet entered the Dern universe through this dimensional gateway, which our ancestors investigated and then found to be Earth's satellite. One consequence of this was that over the course of millions of years, small groups of Plejaren repeatedly migrated to Earth and also died here. Later, when the first human life forms also developed on Earth around 12 million years ago in various areas that are now Europe, Africa, Asia, North and South America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and Russia, as well as various islands, several small groups of our Plejaren ancestors had also already settled in some areas on the planet, but they all died out in the course of the next millions of years. About 6 million years ago, When the distant descendants of the first human beings moved in a few specimens all over the earth and had developed more highly over the next 3 million years, more Playaran emigrants came to Earth, some of whom joined forces with the original earthly humans and mated with them. As for the further teachings of Nocodemion, which concern the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which you have already partly retrieved as a boy for my father Sfath from the memory bank of Nocodemion, he has recorded all this in his annals in handwriting. And what you have been retrieving and elaborating for us for years brings us undreamt of insights and possibilities for the development of consciousness that surpass everything we have known so far and with which we often have trouble understanding everything, which is why the explanatory work you do for us is so significant and very important for us. Unfortunately, however, we can only cope with this if you constantly provide us with the necessary explanations and explanations in your computer, which we can constantly take over and
You should not say too much about it, because it is not pleasant for me when I have to give information about what I write for you, because I have to squirm, because I cannot give these explanations that I just write out for you. This was also the case the other day when I was asked what and how I do the explanations for you, to which I can only explain that you have a higher understanding in this respect than we Earthlings do. Consequently, as you know, I have to interpret the explanations for you with other terms, which on the one hand are not known to us Earthlings, and on the other hand, I also have to search for them in the memory bank and retrieve them.
That is so, I know, as also that it is very tedious for you, and that you cannot translate the necessary terms into your mother tongues German and Swiss German.
It's good that you say that, because if I had to explain these terms to others in plain German, then it would be unavoidable to write explanations as long as your arm for each term. Now, however, something interests me, namely you have said that the Playaran descendant named Avian, who appeared among the Ebraya, thus among the early Hebrews, who was then, however, called Avram, had been of a negroid nature, so a black-skinned human being, as we say. To that, the question whether this man then also founded a family with the Ebraya and fathered offspring.
That was the case, yes, as our handed-down knowledge shows, but this was concealed in the extremely heavily falsified written folk history of the Ebraya, as well as all the facts I have mentioned. In addition, the teaching brought to them of Nocodemion was extensively rejected, and an untrue religious story was invented to the contrary, just as in the same wise was the history of the origin of the Ebraya people's tribes and their descendants. Truthfully, the records were only written out many decades after the real events by scribes with their own interpretations, ideas, and fantasies, just as was the case with the 6 proclaimers. In the case of Muhammad, for example, it was more than 100 years after his death before the first words were written about him, and his teaching was completely disregarded and rewritten and replaced by a completely reinvented one. Hence, the true teaching that Muhammad brought, the teaching of the prophets, that is to say, teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life was not simply falsified beyond recognition, but it was, as was already the case with the same teaching of Emmanuel, completely denied and replaced by a new, truth-falsified religious history that was fantasized together from the ground up and directed towards a godhead and spread. In addition, over the course of centuries, new rules, rituals, prayer, behavior, and other regulations as well as religious laws, etc., were invented over and over again, which were consciencelessly fantasized into the irrationally and confusingly invented senseless religious teaching and were mendaciously ascribed to the proclaimers Emmanuel and Muhammad.
Although I know about these facts, it certainly does not hurt that you also mention something about them. But please, keep talking about what you have to say about your family task.
As I said before, this leads back to Gilcus, but I think that I have made enough explanations regarding this for today, and I will once again speak about that later, should it be necessary.
That may really be the case, but all the things you have mentioned are really interesting and go a lot further than I had hoped to come to know. But you mentioned that some of your ancestors were also religiously believing ones. What was that like, and what is it like today?
In our very early times, too, various religious forms of belief delusion were widespread among all peoples, as a result of which, on all our worlds, the worst Ausartungen and terribleness were also a daily occurrence, as well as malicious wars and terror of all imaginable kinds. Whereas religious wars were likewise unavoidable, as also political wars and pure wars of hatred, etc. All this only ended a little over 52,000 years ago, when what came to pass, which I explained to you in a conversation, namely the whole thing that happened with the moment that soothed everything that was evil, wrong, and ausguarded, and so forth. That's when the large metallic spherical structure influenced all populations of each of our worlds by means of swinging waves for 32 days. In such a way that every single human being became clear and conscious of his or her entire Ausgart, thought-feeling, psychological world. Thus, every single person became frighteningly aware of everything that was lurking and moldering in his or her character and in his or her reflecting and striving, of that which was erroneous and wrong, of that which was evil, loathsome and ausgartet, and could erupt uncontrollably at any time by the smallest trifle which was constantly suppressed by the religious belief delusion, but always lurked in the underground and broke through with every possible negative impulsation to wreak terribleness. This bitter cognition led each individual human being to study the personal thought-feeling psyche world and to transform it into a positive equalizedness according to his or her own choosing and free will, which, however, only became possible as the religious belief delusion was dissolved and became insignificant. But it took a long time for this cognition merely to penetrate, after which it took even longer periods of time to free oneself from the belief delusion. Ultimately, it took between 3 and 11 years for each individual human being, depending on their personality, to carry out the necessary developmental change. And in fact, it was not easy for any human being to break away from his or her religious beliefs. Hence, some persons had to fight hard battles with themselves, which some could not endure to the end and therefore put an end to their lives, as our chronicles tell us. In the end, however, all those who were strong enough were able to overcome everything and to carry out and win the developmental change through their own arduous efforts. That was more than 52,000 years ago, and since then we Plejaren have been free of belief. We no longer have any religions or sects or belief and are completely free of them. And this has since then given us Plejaren the freedom, without belief delusion in a determination by a Godhead, to determine and direct all and everything ourselves in every respect, to move in every kind and wise in peace and harmony among one another and with one another, to communicate with one another, to work with one another, and to correspondingly live according to the whole in a human-worthy wise. And not a single Plejaren person has wanted to lose this since then, and does not want to lose this in the present time, nor in future time as well, which is why our directives were worked out, which are respected and uncontrovertibly followed by every single person, and determine that it must be strictly prevented that not even a single person of us Plejaren may fall prey to a religious belief delusion ever again. But if this were to happen at some point, then the consequence would be that the person in question would be excluded from our entire community and banished to a humankind on a foreign world, such as to the Earth, the humankind of which is just as ausguarded in its belief delusion as the respective person himself or herself. So it is not only due to the entire Ausartungen of all kinds of the human beings of Earth that are wrong, and with acts of Gewalt, one that we must stay away from them and are not allowed to make direct contacts with them, but also the fact of their religious and sectarian belief delusion. This is the case, because owing to that, as with us in times of old, also on the Earth, Wars and struggles for might have been waged since time immemorial. Acts of terror are carried out and millionfold murders are committed. Indeed, because of the religious and sectarian belief delusion, all maliciousness, falsehoods, Ausartungen, intrigues, and wantonness, up to murder and killing, buried in the deepest inner nature of the character and suppressed by the belief delusion and lying in wait to break out as a result of an often only small trifle, very quickly become active and reach the outside to wreak terribleness. And that is exactly what you also teach.
Yes, because it is simply nothing but the truth. But thank you for all that you have done and explained, because everything again allows a valuable insight into your Plejaren history. But now I would like to know from you how you fundamentally assess our earthly politics. Personally, I see the whole thing in such a way that around the world everything goes completely haywire with regard to politics and is only carried out by politically absolutely incapable elements who, with very few exceptions, are only imperious ones, solely directed towards themselves and their own greed for might and finances, who neither do something for their own country nor for the populace, but only for themselves. And as I see it, this is the case in all countries, although some might-obsessed ones stand out particularly in this respect, such as in Germany, in the USA, in the EU dictatorship, and in France.
With this, you are saying something which we are also paying attention to, and I, for my part, can confirm what you have just said. Our observations and clarifications with regard to what you have just mentioned show that in practically all governments of all terrestrial states, with very few exceptions, the highest and higher ones and the responsible ones of state who cooperate with them correspond to absolutely unsuitable elements who do not have true capabilities for the leadership of the state. Hence, they are also unable to establish a clear line of leadership and to make, and accordingly, to carry out any clear and people-serving decisions and directives whatsoever. Their goods of thoughts, actions, and ordinances are extremely inadequate and childishly illogical. All their thinking and acting is solely laid out for their exercising of might, into which, however, neither intellect nor rationality are brought, because the entire majority of those who have might, who misguide the state and the people, amply lack the capabilities to comprehend the effective real reality and its truth. On the one hand, however, this has the consequence that the responsible, mightful ones of state, as a result of their blindness due to their might obsession, do not recognize the effective, truthly connections of the facts available to them, and therefore are also unable to consider and process them, even though they would have to do this. In their reflecting and striving, there is only their might behavior, which through their deceptive imagination and their delusion of wanting to be great, assuming an air of importance and wanting to be knowing, etc., they link up with their religious belief delusion and there, through deceptively imagined to rightfully handle and act on everything, the case of which, however, is absolutely opposite. This, however, has the consequence that they are neither able to perceive nor recognize existing real and true facts, because in their veiled, childishly illogical and never brought to adulthood mode of thinking, as well as in their unused intellect and their insufficient rationality, they are absolutely incapable of doing so. Furthermore, they also lack the effort to create the necessary capability and possibility to perceive the real effective reality and truth. Hence, in this regard, they can neither recognize nor think over arising facts and their contents. As a result of this incapability, they are also not able to work on something in a logically intelligent and rational wise, nor to achieve any logical results or to make and implement any decisions of value. On the contrary, important facts are completely wrongly understood and likewise wrongly assessed, from which an absolutely wrong understanding emerges, and in turn leads to catastrophically dumb wrong decisions, as has always been the case. At the present time, There are truthfully only very few venerable persons in positions of state leadership and among female and male. Politicians who are worthy and dignified for their office, and who also assume their responsibility and put it into action. And this is so, while the absolute majority of all upper and highest officials in the governments and in politics show no suitability whatsoever for a state and political leadership, as is the case today in a particularly bad wise in Germany, which is misgoverned at the front line by a female chancellor who has brought forth a refugee catastrophe that has already spread over the entire earth. In this regard, this person is responsible for a great deal of human misery and many deaths, for which she would need to be harshly brought to account, expelled from the chancellery, and banished for life. This person, in her boundless might obsession, also works under the surface and disingenuously to create a comprehensive new societal regulation throughout Europe. In doing so, her respective secret striving is such that like-minded female politicians and female state officials like her are appointed to high positions of government, namely in the sense to build up in this wise a matriarchal government throughout Europe. First, according to her own sense, this is to happen via the EU dictatorship, for which she has already been making efforts for a considerable time to infiltrate a primarily incapable and might-obsessed female person into the position of President of the EU Commission. Furthermore, she strives in the same wise to arrange the same in Germany and to bring a might-obsessed female person into the Chancellery, something for which she has also been cultivating corresponding thoughts and concocting plans for a considerable time. And this she strives for in the sense that through her the woman is to be given a privileged matriarchal position in the state and in the family, and any patriarchy is to be forbidden. Hence then, in relation to the matriarchy, in order to preserve the female lineage, a hereditary succession and social position is to be strictly determined by law. However, what is still to be said with regard to the unsuitability, wrongdoers and imperious rulers who have already been mentioned, in addition to the aforementioned German mightful one of government and her intellect and rationality less subservient ones who do not perceive what is really going on in the Chancellor in falseness, are also the EU dictatorship as well as France and the USA, which are misgoverned by absolutely incompetent, imperious, and people's-hostile, might-obsessed, and subservient elements. All of these persons exercising might are concerned only with their own advantages, profits and their prosperity, their might behavior and their high rewards, but in no wise with the well-being of their peoples, for whom they would have to take a stand in order to do all that is good and best for them in every respect, but for which they have no interest whatsoever. What is further to be said, which refers to the climate change, which in the coming time, due to the incapability of the governing one's rulers and their wrong decisions, will produce not only strange but also malicious, Osgart and people-damaging poisonous effects, and will make many things even worse. This happens on the one hand because, as a result of the scientific hubris of the ones entrusted with research, nonsensical hypotheses are drawn up which do not correspond to any foundations or things of value whatsoever, and on the other hand, because the real causes are not searched for and researched, and therefore it is also not recognized. That these are altogether attributable to the mass of the overpopulation and its completely Osgarted machinations. These correspond to tremendous life-hostile influences on nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate, and the entire planet, whereby these manipulations, which are to be called criminal, have an absolutely destructive, eliminating and exterminating effect in relation to everything, as a result of which already thousands of widely varying forms of life have already been either irrevocably exterminated or are now threatened with extinction. And these researchers are also the ones who should think ahead with regard to the future, and also achieve truthful results with regard to the destructions brought about by the world's population in nature, to the fauna, flora, and atmosphere, as well as to the climate and planet. However, On the one hand, this is not done in any wise, while on the other hand, the scientists and researchers have no capabilities in this respect either, because they surely carry academic titles, which, however, as you always say, are only smoke and mirrors because they did not study and fathom the effective reality and its truth, but are only indulging in and clinging to empty assumptions. For this reason, it is also not possible for them to explore, to recognize, to understand, and to value the effective facts of the entire natural process in all conceivably possible and necessary relationships. So it is impossible for them to gain the necessary cognitions and to calculate what is pending for the future, necessarily which should be their duty in order to inform and enlighten the Earth's population about the results obtained. Thus, everything continues in the traditional mode of destroying, eliminating and exterminating, so that the entire and further growing overpopulation as well as the nature, fauna, and flora along with the planet are heading for a catastrophe of a kind that has never occurred on Earth before. You already wrote warnings as a boy in the 1940s, and with the help of your teachers Graff, Lehman, and Pastor Zimmerman, who had everything translated also into English. French and Italian, you sent these warnings to numerous newspapers and radio stations, as you also then did in the 1950s, which, however, never brought any public reaction. You have always described very precisely what will come about in the future, as has been happening already for decades, is present, actual, and will continue to come about in the future as a result of overpopulation and its criminal machinations. But your clearly warning efforts to raise awareness have been disregarded. To the contrary, already from the beginning, you were and you still are today, insulted as a world improver and ridiculed, and vilified and slandered as a deceiver and liar by know-it-alls, adversaries, and other self-appointed ones, confused people who very foolishly rise up against you in enmity and revenge. And this is also done in such a way by the religionists in particular, who make the population stupid by lying and deception, who indoctrinate their believers with their illusory and irrational belief teachings, and in this regard force them to the bondage of delusion and dependence. But I digress from what I actually wanted to say, especially in Europe, but also worldwide. More and more wrong decisions will be made by the governments in the coming time, and especially with regard to the epidemic that is now beginning, which you already announced in the 1990s and which will become acute in the month of November and a pandemic in 2020. This, as also with regard to the climate change caused by Earth humans, which has been set in motion as a result of the catastrophic destructive machinations of overpopulation, whereby nature and its fauna and flora have already been largely killed off, ruined, and devastated. In addition, there are the ever more violent, devastating, and frequent storms that degenerate into natural disasters, which on the one hand bring real deluges, and in the future will develop into ever greater and more extensive destructions of nature, and on the other hand will increasingly affect and completely ruin human achievements. And these events alternate with unusual and even death-dealing heat waves for many Earth humans, which will already rise to 43 degrees in Europe this year, whereby from now on the increasing number of natural disasters will also bring more and more often immense and devastating devastation and destruction, and in the coming times will also claim more and more deaths worldwide. This, while also the planet itself will rise up more and more and bring more earthquakes and seaquakes as well as volcanic eruptions, which will not only refer to known active volcanoes, but also to volcanoes that have been inactive for a long time, etc. There will also be an increase in degenerate arsonists indulging in their evil tongues in the forests of Europe and other countries, and I also believe that nature herself will start more and more fires elsewhere in the world, which will become ever more extensive, destructive, and devastating, as I have already said in our last conversations. Also, in the times to come, all acts of murder in families will increase, whereby in many cases all relatives will be killed, and also many other degenerations will steadily increase, which arise as acts of hatred from evil sentiments, such as racial hatred, political extremism, religious hatred against people of other faiths, and as a result of uprisings against errant governments. The times to come will be vicious as never before and will claim countless human lives. And further, through unreasonableness, obsession with power, insanity, stupidity, and pathologically conditioned malicious threats, terror, revenge, self-importance, and confusion of consciousness. The peace on earth, which has been fragile since time immemorial and is always only conditioned by time, will be called into question again and ever more frequently. This is particularly the case with the United States of America and its insane leaders, as well as with the EU dictatorship leadership, which will, however, be replaced next month by an unfit and Russia-hostile personality. Now, however, back to what I was talking about earlier. But now various countries on Earth keep so-called lists with regard to extinct plants, animals, and other creatures, etc. In addition, red lists of endangered animals and plants are kept. Although only species previously known to the Earth's humankind are specified in these lists, and of which about 28,000 are listed as endangered, but the many species still unknown to them are not mentioned. According to our investigations, however, these data do not correspond to the rightness, because the number of life forms of plants, animals, and other creatures endangered and threatened by extinction on Earth, as well as lizards, insects, fish, creepers, crawlers, and snakes, as well as butterflies and beetles of all species and forms, which do not belong to as well as other living creatures, is very much higher than only 28,000. The number of endangered species and forms we have fathomed today amounts to 36,642, which includes a larger number of life forms that are not yet known to either zoology, entomology, or botany. The threat of the dying out and extinction of zoological, entomological, and botanical species and forms, etc., continues to grow and, moreover, at an ever-increasing rate. Hence, the species and forms not only die more and more quickly, but effectively dies out. As our long-term research has shown, which we have been carrying out on a daily basis for many years. At present, between about 70 and 180 botanical, animal, other creatures, and entomological, as well as lizard-like, creeping, water-dependent, and other species and forms are dying out every day. And this can no longer be stopped, which means that the entire destruction of the diversity of species and forms of terrestrial living creatures and biodiversity can no longer be stopped. This, unless the delusion of the Earth's population regarding the further excessive procreation of offspring is stopped very quickly, whereas this should have already happened in 1975 at the very latest, and should have been implemented from this time on by means of a worldwide multi-year stop in births and a subsequent and henceforth controlled regulation of births. Up to that time, it still would have been possible to stop all the destructive bad effects to the atmosphere, the climate, the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, and to bring them back to the normal course, which would have been possible at that time through an efficient intellect and rationality-bearing action, but which is no longer the case today. However, this is no longer possible today because too much has been destroyed in the entirety of nature and on the planet itself, and too many life forms have been irrevocably exterminated. And this happened due to the felonious machinations of the overpopulation, and namely due to its need for consumer goods such as food, supplies and consumables, etc., whereby the whole of the destroying increased ever more in relation to the mass of the constantly rising overpopulation, and today also continues to rise uncontrollably, which up to the present day could only be mastered by intervening destructively and exterminatingly in nature, its fauna and flora, and in the planet itself, now also devastatingly influencing the atmosphere and the climate. The dwindling biodiversity already threatens the earthly humankind today, which unfortunately is still not recognized and, for that matter, will not be understood by all researchers who arrogantly call themselves expert scientists, and neither by the Earth's population. Consequently, it continues in the same and all-destructive style. This means, however, that through all the exploitative machinations of the overpopulation, the diversity of species and biodiversity of the Earth and its nature and fauna and flora will continue to be exterminated and disappear, which will ultimately threaten and call into question the survival of all life and even that of the entire planet. Due to unintellect dumbness and irresponsibility, the majority of the human beings of Earth delude themselves through unintellect and irrationality into thinking that if a single grass or herb, a tiny animal or insect, etc., dies out, this would be of absolutely no significance concern. Because indeed one's personal food would not be affected by it, and nothing therefrom would be lacking in life, which is why it is of no importance if something small dies out. At the same time, no thought is given to the fact that the extinction and disappearance of even a single plant species or a single small animal accelerates the dying of insects and the extinction of another animal species. Fundamentally, the bulk of the Earth humankind does not bother about nature, its fauna, flora, and the atmosphere and climate, but lives senselessly just for the moment, as you put it from time to time in our private conversations. So no thought is given to the fact that, for example, bees as well as various other insects are very important pollinators of blossoms for many types of food, which for example account for 1/3 of the natural food of the terrestrial humankind. The dying out of a variety of these insect species forms has already today had negative consequences regarding the production of various natural foods, wherethrough already for decades famines have prevailed in countries disadvantaged therethrough, and many human beings have been dying tormentfully of hunger. The overpopulated humankind of Earth does not think about the, in fact, extremely dire consequences that will result in the future from the ongoing dying of species. Consequently, terrible consequences already in the offing are also not foreseeable for them. That, however, will change in the future for the descendants of tomorrow's and the day after tomorrow's irresponsible humankind of Earth, because it will be those who will experience and get to feel the evil consequences in the future and will curse their ancestors and their irresponsibility for that. Yet, it is not only that which is clear today regarding the extinction of many diverse genera and species, but in the future there will also be many more and other animals, plants as well as many other creatures, insects, and other diverse forms of life, which likewise will be threatened by extinction in the future. That, however, does not concern the human beings of Earth at the present time, because they cannot yet consider at all which monstrously terrible consequences the extinction of the respective additional genera and species will entail. And it is solely and exclusively the enormously burdensome, unsupportable, and unsustainable overpopulation for planet Earth, with all its destructive machinations, that will be to blame for this, as is also the case today for everything that has already happened in this respect, concerning the various exterminations of different genera and species of the natural diversity of life and biodiversity. That is because it does not want to be recognized that the immoderate, excessive, and exaggerated overpopulation and all its destructive machinations of nature, fauna, flora, and the atmosphere and climate are to blame for everything. And it does not want to be recognized nor acted in such a way that only by a drastic worldwide and multi-year birth stop and an equally drastic worldwide control of births could the worst still be prevented, and thereby could a regeneration of the still salvageable take place. Nevertheless, in this case, a regeneration of what is still salvageable in terms of nature. Fauna and flora, the planet itself, as well as the atmosphere and climate would require a very long time, namely over many generations. However, what is now being done irresponsibly is that an adolescent and unknowing child named Greta Thunberg is being shamefully abused to lead a worldwide Fridays for Future climate protection movement. This, despite the fact that this innocent child has no idea or knowledge whatsoever concerning the actual exterminative and destructive connections with respect to nature, fauna, flora, and the planet as well as the climate, etc. Moreover, the unknowing child, who in the meantime, since her first appearance, has fallen into a delusion of self-elevation, is afflicted by a milder autism, as a result of which she has a weakness with regard to any social interaction and also in terms of communication. This child also suffers from further disorders in such a wise that she is steered by habits and customs and does not show any form/characteristic of deep feelings for others, as I could clearly diagnose. As a result of a delayed development of consciousness, she is also not able to perceive reality and its truth in a correct, intellectually and rationally clear wise, which is why she tends to indulge in individual factors of any matter in her thoughts, without being able to comprehend their fundamental factors in their reality. Hence, she cannot effectively empathize with her actions regarding her climate protest, just as she cannot do so due to the absence of the ability to perceive impulsations regarding any life forms of nature and with human beings. The child is also characterized by a severely inadequate social incapability, as well as sporadically also by an attention deficit, whereas she is nevertheless driven by a strong inner pathological compulsion with her climate protest activity. Climate change, which was first denounced by an unknowing child, and since then has created a stir before governments all over the world, and moreover has brought forth masses of simple-minded/naive screaming climate protesters who, just like the child, have no idea and knowledge at all about what the fact actually is, has the consequence that those in government and the politicians will start to exploit the whole thing in a populist wise and also in a wise in order to fill their state coffers thereby. This will be the case, as irresponsible leaders and politicians will invent and implement new mandatory levies and taxes, which will then correspond to nothing other than a financial exploitation of the populations. In order to stuff up the state coffers in this illegal wise, whose finances, however, will again be senselessly squandered and, in addition to that, more debts will be made. What I now have to say, however, corresponds to facts that do not really correspond to the nature of what I want to go on about, because it does not correspond to my needs to interfere in the irrational and confused, wrong, dumb, and illogical governmental leadership machinations, as well as the modes of action and behavior of earthly governments and politics. Nonetheless, however, I see a need to do so today and to say, nevertheless, that the absolute majority of earthly rulers and politicians can be assessed as grown up according to their physical maturity, but not in terms of their adulthood consciousness. In this respect, the absolute majority, no matter how old he or she is in each individual case in terms of years of life, lives in an unadulterated childlike state with regard to his or her intellect and rationality. In this state, however, he or she lacks the ability to evaluate, as well as the ability to make decisions, to act, behave, and take responsibility, as a result of which he or she is incapable of leading populations and peoples. And this incapability, as well as his or her selfishness and cowardice for recognition in relation to the reality and truth, as well as the anxiety of public opinion, etc., leads to the fact that he or she does not muster any thoughts whatsoever to face the truth openly and to realize that the reality is different from what he or she claims to know it to be. So he or she neither strives for the reality and its truth, nor for what would necessarily have to be recognized and taught in relation to the real causes of the atmospheric degradation, the climate destruction, the threat to all life and the destruction of nature as well as the planet itself. This is equally true in relation to the extinction of the species diversity of the entire biodiversity of the flora, but also in relation to the existence of the steadily increasing threat to the fauna, in which ever more genera and species of all kinds of life forms are dying out due to the guilt of the human being of Earth. And the fact that the whole of all misery and evil, of destruction, death and extermination, etc., is only rampant through the guilt of the humankind of Earth. Namely, because of the monstrous overpopulation from which all life is called into question by its machinations, does not concern the highest and higher ones who bear the responsibility for the world. And if the further growth of the overpopulation is not stopped by a worldwide and multi-year birth stop and afterwards, an effective worldwide birth control is not decided upon and carried out, which should have already been done by 1975 at the latest, which, however, was not done, then the exterminations and destructions will continue and finally an unstoppable destruction of the entire existence of the Earth and all its forms of life of all genera and species will lead to the bitter end. Secret plans are already being devised to disingenuously and insidiously exploit the peoples with new taxes, such as involving levies of premiums for the alleged protection of the climate, as well as tax collections for the discharge expulsion of all kinds of emissions. To this end, the use of today's technology will be considered in order to coercively force new taxes and other levies on the populations, who often must very arduously perform their daily work for low wages and live in meagerness, while those in government, due to taxpayer funds laboriously earned by the working class, live in the lap of luxury and are exempted from the new taxes and levies. As a matter of fact, the first beginnings are already in place to exploit the populations with new levies and taxes, and indeed for their emissions output, by intending to financially rob heating systems, means of sport, of transport, and of travel, industrial machines, ships, and airplanes, as well as various other things that still generate large amounts of emissions. The reason for this is that there are still no really effective as well as other and better possibilities to produce and use other vehicles. Heating systems, airplanes, ships, and industrial machinery, etc., that are free of CO2 and other emissions. The recently popular electric vehicles are not a solution either, which are propagated in order to reduce the harmful and climate-damaging release of emissions. Because on the one hand, this unconsidered, erroneous, and confused propaganda leads to a frenzy of production, and on the other hand, to an, even today, unmistakable hostility of that large part of the peoples, who have fallen prey and will continue to fall prey to the climate protection delusion, which has been suggestively and forcefully brought about by the use of Greta Thunberg, and which has now also penetrated into the governments and henceforth is also intended to serve for the financial exploitation of the populations. As far as the fact of the effective origin of climate destruction is concerned, this cannot be recognized and understood by the child Greta Thunberg, any more than it can by all the worldwide masses who foolishly, imprudently, and simple-mindedly carry out climate demonstrations by shouting for and cheering and making senseless demands. Demands that reach the populists who feel threatened in their positions and are directed by those who wrongly govern and policymakers, who are now reaching out to the climate demonstration mob and are supposed to follow their senseless demands. And those, as you always say, who fear like whimpering wolves for their offices. These are the ones who, for that reason, set their banner exactly according to the climate demonstration show of climate demonstrators, and, as you simply put it, whimper together. The totality of this governmental machination, that is to say, the whimpering of governments and all other authorities, organizations and climate protectors, is only vain pretense and deception, as are their useless proposals and resolutions of every kind. And this is the case, because fundamentally the only solution is solely by means of a stop in births for many years and thereafter, an ongoing and controlled regulation in births, to bring the humankind of Earth to a planet-appropriate population number and to maintain this number. Only by doing so is it possible to also stop the Ausertungen, destructions, eliminations and exterminations of all kinds by the criminal machinations of the overpopulation. And is it possible in the course of a very long time, under certain circumstances and efforts, to partially calm down and semi-normalize some things in nature and on the planet itself? To a large extent, this is no longer possible and can also no longer be realized, because far too much has already been destroyed, eliminated and exterminated in nature, fauna and flora, and also the planet itself has been irresponsibly and feloniously exploited with regard to its resources. Hence, viewed for a long time from the perspective of humankind of a distant future, it has already become useless at the present time. This fact already shows today that a continued existence of the Earth humankind in the more distant future could only occur if a broad-scale emigration of humanity, that is to say, a humankind resettlement to a new, very distant and not yet destroyed planet, would take place. This, however, would correspond to nothing more than a very uncertain hope. If it could be taken into consideration, and indeed also because foreign planetary peoples would possibly not be willing to let an ethically and morally ausgart humankind immigrate. That is to say, enter into their solar and planetary system exactly of the wise like the Earth humankind, whose majority is mentality-wise in a bad way. And yet again I am straying from what I fundamentally want to say regarding climate change and the senseless, inappropriate, and dumb demands of the climate demonstrators and the governments. A still effective climate transformation can no longer be achieved in the short term, as I have already mentioned. Consequently, corresponding ideas, wishes, endeavors, efforts, and proposals, etc., are senseless and thus completely unlogical and not designed for a worldwide birth stop and thus not laid out to stop and end all destructive, eliminating and exterminating machinations with regard to the excessive needs of the overpopulation. All the demands that the discharge of harmful emissions, particularly CO2, should be restricted. Therefore, in vehicles of all kinds, in aircraft, ships, industrial machinery and heating systems, etc., or that these should generally be prohibited and that the entirety of such equipment, machines, vehicles, as well as means of transport, etc., should be converted, modernized, and replaced by an electrification cannot be more illusory. Of course, by such measures, this is undisputable. Certain emissions could be somewhat curtailed. But this would correspond to nothing more than a drop in the ocean, as you comparatively put it, in regard to certain incidental things that are useless when they are done. Fact is, namely, that even by a small reduction of all harmful emissions, nothing would change in the whole of all impairments, damages with regard to the atmosphere, the climate, the planet, and its nature, as well as its fauna and flora. This because the mass of the Earth-human overpopulation continues to increase excessively, and no worldwide multi-year necessary birth stop and a subsequent regulation of births is being implemented. With the further growth of the overpopulation and the planetary and life-destroying machinations that increase with each new birth of a human being of Earth, all the demands of the simple-minded child Greta Thunberg and her equally unknowing, simple-minded adherents of hers and climate demonstrators to be called foolish dumb become to the ridiculousness. This also includes the actions of those in government and politicians, who also ridicule themselves in their foolishness, which might amuse the peoples if the entire terribleness were not so serious, because these highest and upper ones of the state leaderships also do not perceive and therefore also do not understand what the calamity really requires. And this requirement, namely a multi-year birth stop and thereafter a pervasive control of births, is unavoidable to reduce the humankind of Earth in the foreseeable future in a rational and human-worthy wise. But this is not taken into consideration and is rejected by the humankind of Earth, because it wants to maintain and not restrain its criminal machinations for its necessities of life, its prosperity, its food and luxury goods, as well as its addiction to vacations and travel. But only by doing what is necessary can all life and all existence be protected and preserved. Indeed, only if the overpopulation threatening all life and all existence, with all its endangering machinations, is brought under control. Only therethrough can that which has not yet been destroyed and eradicated in the variety of species of the entire biodiversity and on the planet itself gradually recover and regenerate over a process lasting many centuries.
Thank you. Long monologue. Long sense, for which I think that it is good that you, too, have said something once in this wise, and not just always I. This I find particularly good because each human being must represent his or her own personal opinion, just as, however, everyone also has to respect the opinion of another. And thereto I behave strictly in this wise. Hence, I regard any opinion of a human being as his or her right and respect it. And indeed, no matter what kind of opinion this is and how it is represented, as long as it is not criminal, not felonious, and therefore also not against life and limb and the safety of human beings or the tormenting and so forth, with respect to any other life forms. Thus, every human being fundamentally has the right to his or her own opinion, and this also applies for every religious, philosophical, ideological, worldly, or other belief, no matter how irrational and crazy it may be. But it must simply not be criminal or felonious and not guarded against life and limb. Looked at and considered from this perspective, I leave every human being with his or her opinion as he or she is. Which is why I also never have a goat a religious believer and also do not attack his or her delusion, unless conversely he or she provocatively does so against me. In principle, however, I leave every human being as he or she is, thinking and believing. Consequently, I accept him or her as a human being as he or she is with his or her opinion. Therefore, I show him or her as such the necessary honor and dignity, and do not condemn him or her, but show and teach him or her that it is dumbness if he or she thinks something wrongly, acts wrongly, or behaves wrongly, which brings harm to him or her or to other human beings.
It has long urged me to say something once myself of the kind I did. And that which you have now further explained regarding your behavior with respect to your acceptance of the opinions of other human beings, on that point I know perfectly well that this is really your irreproachable style.
But now it's done, and it is probably good and right as such. But I would also like to say something about this, namely that the climate screamers of all kinds, thus also those from climate protection organizations, as well as those who are now running their big mouths in governments and in politics, do not want to hear the truth of the real cause of the climate destruction. The reason for this is quite clearly that we do not want to think about the fact that overpopulation, with its destructive machinations of all kinds, is to blame for everything, as well as the fact that only by a stop in births of long-standing form and a control of births can the ultimate disastrous outcome and terribleness still be prevented. Now it is probably more than just 7 years with regard to a stop in births, because the mass of the humankind has increased enormously since then, at the time when those 7 years were called for. The majority of human beings of Earth are simply unteachable and so egoistic, self-centered and conscienceless towards the Earth, nature, its fauna, flora, the atmosphere and the climate, that it is enough to make you weep. And this majority is also absolutely indifferent to the entire earthly existence and all life in general, which is why it stubbornly refuses to even consider for a moment that the omittance of offspring creation is also part of the entire existence and the whole life activity of all life forms on Earth. This stubbornness, indifference, and also the irresponsibility are not connected with that and have effectively nothing to do with it, that one's own free opinion is formed and gets represented, but rather only with the fact that the personal egoism is set above everything in all circumstances and enforced, contrary to all rationality and responsibility, and implemented by hook or by crook. Another thing, I think, is the fact that the humankind of Earth has to be divided into 6 categories, which is as follows. Firstly, with the majority of Earthlings nowadays, it is generally not possible to have a proper and interesting as well as obliging, courteous, and valueful communication. Secondly, nowadays the majority of the humankind no longer cultivates any valueful interpersonal relationships whatsoever. Hence, the human bonding in general has already dwindled to such an extent and will continue to dwindle even further, that not even genuine connecting acquaintanceships, let alone honest and sincere friendships, can come about. Thirdly, the majority of the humankind today is completely passive with regard to really valueful and value-enduring interests and activities, and is becoming more and more emotionally stunted consciousness and intellect, rationality-wise. No longer forms his or her intellect and intelligentum, but vegetates more and more by the brainless use of always newer technical and electronic achievements, which drives the consciousness to blunting. Fourthly, the majority of the humankind today is so obtuse that they are no longer capable of forming their own opinion, but just fall into a bondage when, by means of hammered-in suggestively populist slogans, lies, promises, and slander, they fall prey to a deluded belief, which is imposed upon them by politicians, rulers, clerics, preachers, sect chiefs, or members of secret societies, etc., and they let themselves be pestered, duped, and deluded to the will and opinion of those. Fifthly, the majority of the humankind today is completely indifferent toward the fellow human beings, toward nature and its fauna and flora, as well as with regard to the effective reality and its truth. Sixthly, only a very small part of the present-day humankind is interested in the effective reality and truth of all things, as in relation to the entire existence of all that exists in every kind and wise. All that is planetarily as well as universally and altogether creationally given in every respect. That altogether only one's own rationality-bearing and responsibility-conscious opinion is formed and represented. After all, it is effectively the case that the overwhelming vast majority of earthlingness uses neither intellect nor rationality, and is therefore going around dull and blind in sheer foolishness dumbness, is interested in nothing at all, other than only just his or her own well-being, enough money and the necessary needs to be able to exist at all.
Your words in the earth-human ear, for thither they belong.
If you are right, then it is also such. But continuing to talk about it is pointless anyway, so it's probably better if I ask you something that interests me. Fundamentally, there is nothing left on the earth in the free nature and its fauna and flora, which would not be contaminated by any pesticides, plant protection products and the like, etc., and indeed not by the natural toxins that emerge in the free nature, rather by artificial toxins of all conceivable kinds produced by the earthlings. Your father, Svath, already explained to me in the mid-1940s that all toxins of all kinds originating in the free nature, that is to say organic toxins isolated from bacteria, plants or animals, fish, crawlers, insects, snakes, and from other creatures and so forth, or those resulting from the decomposition of bacteria, no matter which ones, do not occur in excessive quantities and also are not necessarily fatal, unlike lethal toxins produced by the earthlings. He also said that in the next few years, these toxins will already find their way into all naturally planted foods, as well as into the groundwater, and thus into the food chain of the human beings. This would then already be scientifically detectable from the 1950s onwards, and will also be scientifically recognized. However, the research results in this regard would be kept secret from the public by the scientists responsible for them and the authorities, despite the fact that the Swiss Federal Health Authority would also be concerned with it, which, if I remember correctly, would be transformed in the 1960s into a Federal Office of Public Health or something, after which this office would, however, be renamed again in the 1980s and referred to in short as BAG. Today, we are talking about the Federal Office of Public Health, which belongs to the Department of Home Affairs and is responsible for the national health policy, and in this respect for furthering the health of the Swiss population. In this context, however, it is incomprehensible that this office has not prohibited the entire application of toxins, but rather still claimed to the contrary, that certain very small quantities would be harmless and tolerable for the human organism. And this contradicts what you have already often explained, as also did your father. Svath, that toxins of any kind, even as the very smallest amount in the range of a single microgram, would be just as harmful to the entire organism of the human being as they are to all life forms in general. And Svath explained, just as you also said, that the fact is that in the future such minimal traces of toxins would cause many kinds of sufferings for the human being, which would not exist without these toxic supplies into the organism. This means, therefore, that from even these most minimal traces of toxins, new sufferings, damages, injuries, and pains will result, which previously did not exist or only negligibly little, but which, since the introduction and spreading of the toxins, have increased alarmingly, which advance the already existing ones and cause new sufferings.
This is indeed the case. But it is also to be mentioned that already since the mid-1960s, the groundwater has also been contaminated by the various toxins that have been irresponsibly spread throughout the entire nature and flora. And as toxin-carrying drinking water, these substances thereby also find their way into the human organism as well as by the finest particles of poison that float in the breathing air of the atmosphere and end up in the lungs as a consequence of inhalation, and in turn thereby into the blood and the entire organism.
This is surely the case, and indeed, you must know this much better than our scientists, who, in comparison to your much more advanced cognitions and experiences, are practically just slowly crawling out of their caves and seeing the first blades of grass, in which they perceive its coarse outer structure, which they cannot yet explain nor recognize the first details. If we look at and consider what has come about since the 1940s regarding the use of toxins in nature, then what Svath has said proves to be reality today. Because in the meantime, his predictions have long since become fact and truth, namely, that through the release of artificial toxins into nature in the time to come, seen from back then, indeed starting from the second half of the 19th century and the present and future times, will cause deformations and other changes to the extremities of the body of human beings, as well as health damages and injuries will appear to faunal and floral forms of life. This, as I have already said, is the case with the release and use of quantities which are generally harmful, which of course is to be assessed relatively. Svath also explained at the time that these artificial toxins will also cause severe negative changes in the brain of the human being and adversely affect the consciousness, which could lead to the mental dumbing down. However, it would also be the case, as he particularly mentioned at that time, that due to the effects of the all-contaminating artificial toxins, serious and also many kinds of as well as partly incurable diseases and illnesses would be caused in the majority of the humankind, as well as such changes in consciousness and heavy consciousness damages would occur, which will impair the use of the intellect and rationality by the human being, and in some cases make it completely impossible. Therethrough, he explained, as I remember very well, the consciousness power of many human beings would sink and they would become extremely prone to unlogical thinking, acting and concerning addictions. As furthermore, the human being's own ability to consider and to make decisions would be strongly impaired, weakened, and manipulated by externally directed influencings. Now, I have thought about all that Svath explained to me in this regard on various occasions, and have come to the conclusion that the explanation for this can probably be that the consciousness damage and changes in consciousness caused by the toxins, as well as the impairment of intellect and rationality, as your father predicted, correspond to that which you already ascertained and said a few years ago, that you did not detect any consciousness progress in the majority of the human beings of Earth, but rather an atrophy of consciousness. If I bear this in mind, then it must probably be the case that in the majority of Earthlings, the already not very highly developed intelligentum in relation to its level is steadily diminishing further. That is to say that the state of being intelligent is withering more and more as a result of the non-use of intellect and rationality. And in my opinion, this can only happen if the intellect is no longer formed as a result of the absence and non-exercise of the required necessary intellect-rationality work. This, however, I can very well imagine for human beings who have fallen prey to religious delusional beliefs as well as ideologies. Dubious, doubtful philosophies and any other beliefs, ingrained false and wrong teachings, instructions, as well as false and wrong information, wrong views and/or guidances into the unreal and confusions. This just to such an extent as the majority of the human beings of this world is affected by and smitten with such influences, and in this wise is suggestively influenced and indoctrinated into and becomes infatuated, enticed and deceived by a belief of some kind by other human beings, and assumes that he or she has now found and won the non plus ultra of all wisdom. However, in truth has fallen prey to a confused guidance into the unreal. And this happens because these human beings do not turn to the effective reality and its only truth, and do not seek and search for the truth in themselves in a completely neutral wise by freeing themselves from every belief and external influence, but learn to be themselves and to trust only themselves. This, however, means that the human being, no matter however and whoever he or she may be, does not cling to any belief, and that everything brought to him or her is considered, fathomed, processed, and turned into his or her very own knowledge. In doing so, he or she must also not let anything be decided by others with regard to the learning and the search for truth, but this may and must be solely and exclusively left to himself or herself in every respect, because only he or she alone is himself or herself and may and can only decide about himself or herself, but never another human being. A belief, however, corresponds in each individual case to an external suggestive and indoctrinating influence and coerces the human being to believe in something that has been hammered into him or her, wherethrough he or she inevitably loses in every respect his or her independence of his or her personal search, as well as his or her own pondering, deliberating back and forth, his or her personal search for the truth and its finding. Through believing, the human being loses his or her autonomy, independence and self-recognition in every kind and wise, as well as his or her personal freedom of decision and decision capability, wherethrough he or she inevitably becomes a slave of his or her belief, from which he or she can then no longer free himself or herself again, or only very arduously and with difficulty, if at all. But what now interests me is that what your great-great-great-great-grandfather did here on Earth. You once mentioned him briefly in a private conversation, but I have forgotten his name.
My great-great-great-grandfather was called Isobron, and the meaning of the name is, he begins a storm with thunder. He was a linguist and a scribe and came to Earth with many of his students at the time of the Mediterranean Middle Eastern civilizations. He settled in the region that was then called Egypt and continues to exist as such to this day, although he traveled far and wide, including to the country that is now called Greece. In accord with his knowledge, he was always striving hard to spread the art of writing and the languages, which he also made an effort to do around the Mediterranean Sea among the various peoples who accepted his teachings and learned writing. Depending on the people and the language, he taught them the most diverse forms of writing, from pure pictorial writing to the graphic design of typesetting fonts in various languages. Likewise did all his students of both sexes, who spread out all over the earth and taught the peoples who, at that time, were not yet very large in terms of numbers, in writing and language. And when I speak of peoples, then the populations themselves is not meant by this, but only those of them who, even at that time, were striving for a higher education and for more knowledge and so forth than was characteristic of the majority of the peoples.
So at that time, your great-great-great-grandfather was on the earth and taught writing to the early peoples, just as his students did all over the world. Hence one can say that actually all of the early written languages used on earth by the earthly peoples lead back to a Plejaren origin.
You could put it like that, yes. In the course of time, these scripts were of course changed in their form again and again or put out of use, which is why many of the original types of script only exist as historical remnants, if at all. But what is also to be said about this is the fact that, unfortunately, already very early on, written language was misused by earthly scribes. This happened in particular by literate persons, who recorded historical events in writing, which they themselves nevertheless interpreted inadequately and completely wrongly according to their own and inaccurate observations, as well as very often deluded perceptions as well as imaginations, inadequate poor memories and assumptions. This was likewise the case when the scribes were engaged and contracted by the people for the purpose of writing records. While without exception, it was the case that the persons capable of script and thus of writing never wrote down exactly what they were instructed, assigned to write. As a consequence, it always happened that the human beings who called upon those versed in writing, because they themselves simply were unknowledgeable in writing and therefore of written language, could do nothing other than to explain to the scribes, in their simple language, to put their concerns down in writing, etc., those capable of writing, then, through their own interpretations, allowed themselves to write down what had been explained and said to them according to their own understanding and their own interpretations. And the reason for this was because those who did not know how to write, who commissioned something to be written, were unable to dictate what they had to say and explain directly into the written language. That is why wrong descriptions and, in some cases, extremely grave wrong interpretations arose as a result of the scribes' own interpretations, which have survived to the present time and are taught in equally wrong forms. Equally, this happened at all times with regard to all religious written records, because only one person, and apart from that one person, not a single person to whom the written traditions are ascribed was knowledgeable of the script and the written language. Consequently, they all had their statements written down by those well-versed in writing and the written language, who formulated everything according to their own writing abilities and also wrote everything down via their own interpretations and assumptions, etc. This was also the case with all the major and minor religions and their sects, thus also with Islam and Christianity. After Emmanuel's flight from Jerusalem, his entire life history from birth up to his death was spread and later also written down with monstrous falsifications. Lies, assertions, and calumnies. Thus the same happened with Muhammad, whose real name indeed was Abdul Qasim Muhammad ibn Abdallah. In Emmanuel's case, only Judas Iscarioth was well versed in writing. However, neither any female nor male member of his discipleship, which included more persons than just the 12 listed in the New Testament, which is full of inventions, falsifications, wrong commemorative claims, interpretations, and lies. In addition, the individual chapters, assertions, claims, and recollections, etc. of this work of lies were not written until many years after his flight, by scribes, and moreover were written in a further falsifying wise through their own additional interpretations, and partly also attributed to former disciples, who, however, never took part in such writings, and thus did not provide any information whatsoever, out of which the work of lies called New Testament then arose. For the purpose of rectification, you indeed have also given the various necessary details and explanations wherethrough he has carried out relevant investigations, but is also how he found out much of the actual truth and was also able to record it in writing. I must say, however, that it is regrettable that you and Guido had to promise to him, during his lifetime, not to mention his name and his written works, which has extraordinarily good evidence facts, unfortunately. The man also withholds that of your information made known to him, which should actually be mentioned openly with regard to the entire origin of the history of Emmanuel. If one has a close look at the life history of Muhammad, then it must also be said concerning this, that there is hardly a true word in all that which is supposedly handed down about him. For just as with Emmanuel, all around no one was knowledgeable in writing and written language, except his first wife, the widow Chadidshka. She was a member of the highly respected Quraysh tribe and heiress of a caravanserai and a trading business in Mecca. At first, under her matriarchy, Muhammad did various works for her before they got together and married, after which she appointed him as a business partner. The woman was connected to Muhammad by sincere love and was also able to connect with his teaching, which she held in high regard, although she did not record a single word of his teaching or of his life in writing. The incredibly infamous calumny that Muhammad is said to have fathered several children with this woman corresponds to a lie beyond compare, because the woman was incapable of conception and therefore could not be impregnated by Muhammad. However, since Khadijah wanted to have children, it was decided in agreement between her and Muhammad to adopt several orphans and to secretly pretend that they were their own. After his wife died, he married Sauda bint Zama as his second wife, with whom, however, he also did not father any descendants, nor with Aisha bint Abi Bakr, who was his third wife and who, contrary to the slanderous traditions, was neither 6 nor 7 or 9 years old at the time of marriage, but 19 years of age. And the malicious story of slander against her, which is said to have arisen during the campaign against the Banu el-Mustalik in the year 627, is just as much a malicious lie as is the story of the 12 mothers of the believers, which was built up on nothing more than lies and deception. This applies equally to the many lies that Muhammad, in addition to his regular marriage, married a greater number of women and had slaves as concubines. For in fact it was only the 3 wives Khadijah, Sauda bint Zama and Aisha bint Abi Bakr, whom he had married after the death of Khadijah, and also these marital bonds remained childless, because even with these 2 women he was not of the sense to procreate offspring. All the larger numbers of other women who were around him were in no way in any marital connection with him, nor in any kind of relationship of a slavish or concubine-like nature. Rather, they were all well protected in his care and friendship. So, long after his death, other women were imputed to him by lies and calumnies of alleged relatives and chroniclers and so forth, and had no truth content whatsoever. This also applies to the veiling of women, as well as to completely different senselessnesses. Maliciously minded ones who were against the spreading of the early wrong Christianity that had emerged centuries earlier, through which the true teaching of the proclaimer Emmanuel was completely falsified, saw in it an opportunity to falsify the teaching of Muhammad as well. So, in his time, they seized the opportunity to falsify his teaching, which was indeed the same as that of Emmanuel, and to spread rules and regulations, just as it was with regard to the teaching of Emmanuel. Just as Emmanuel was not able to defend himself against it, so it also happened with Muhammad, because when both had gone their last way, their ever-identical teaching was abysmally falsified, and new religions were created from it. As a consequence, the believers turned to the new teachings, to which Muhammad and Emmanuel could no longer oppose because of their departure. Hence Christianity with the New Testament and Islam with the recitation. That is to say, the Quran completely suppressed the truthful teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Ancient Palestine was occupied by the Romans at the time of Emmanuel and had experienced some increase in prosperity under them, even though the native population was directed by a harsh Jewish and religious-oriented rule, which is why it was opportune for the emerging Christians to devise a story of lies of a resurrection of the crucified Emmanuel and to call him Jesus. This, while southern Arabia was a very backward area at the time of Muhammad, far away from all the cultural and economic centers of the world at that time, where the human beings who were poor suffered great hardship and were only too happy to believe in and fall prey to a new religion of salvation. If the old scrolls writings are examined, which are supposed to come from disciples, direct followers and the like, as well as from direct or indirect descendants, relatives or from family members of the 2 proclaimers, then all such alleged written proofs correspond altogether to only sneaky and disingenuous falsifications. wrong memories only partly true, and wrong renditions as well as very fallible interpretations by the scribes. Truthfully, there is not a single such ancient document which would be directly or semi-directly related to a person who had been in direct or indirect contact with Emmanuel or Muhammad. Claims to the contrary and so-called written documentary evidence proofs correspond to nothing other than falsifications and lies. Because in the case of both Emmanuel as well as Muhammad, the first written records were made only years later after their departure, that is to say, after their death. And this happened according to very inadequate or erroneous memories, but also through conscious false claims and lies, etc., as a result of which glorifications and fairy tales regarding Emmanuel and Muhammad also came about. In addition, various direct and indirect followers were fraudulently, lyingly attributed to the two proclaimers, who in truth, however, had nothing to do with them. Even disciples, followers and relatives as well as friends, etc., versed in writing, were attributed to the two proclaimers, Emmanuel and Muhammad, at all times. But out of all those mentioned, not a single one was knowledgeable of the script and writing. Judas Iscarioth was the only one amongst all who correctly and truthfully mastered the script and who was well versed in writing and a disciple close to Emmanuel. Later he was slandered by falsifiers of writings and by hangers-on, just as the name of Jesus was then also imputed to Emmanuel. So it must repeatedly be made clear that everything was the same with Muhammad and Emmanuel, although concerning Emmanuel, it was Judas Iscarioth who was well versed in script, writing, and written language, and who made the Chronicles, from which the Talmud then arose through your and the group members' efforts, which in the end had to be correctly translated and revised by our script and language expert specialists. Because the priest Isa Rashid had translated it wrongly according to his Christian deluded belief. This, while all other records concerning the teaching of Emmanuel and Muhammad were in no way made by any of their disciples or direct or indirect descendants, etc., but by strangers, namely even only a long time after their death. Truthfully, however, in relation to the two of them and their teaching, which on both sides was the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, everything was abysmally misunderstood and boundlessly falsified beyond recognition. This also applies to various other ancient and newly discovered old writings, which likewise do not lead back to any disciples during the lifetime of Emmanuel or to direct followers or relatives and so forth of Muhammad.
So does that also apply to Chronicles?
Yes, that is so, because records of all kinds, therefore including Chronicles, have always been made out by means of personal interpretations of the writers since time immemorial, which is often still the case at the present time. And not only when writing down historical facts in relation to annals and chronicles, but especially when it comes to channels of information, such as public media of all kinds. This also includes descriptions by observers and witnesses of any happenings and situations, who, even though they have made the same observations and perceptions of the exact same thing, provide completely contrary and contradictory information. Therethrough occur along with wrong interpretations, as well as through withholding and concealment, wrong perceptions and wrong observations, etc., of effective facts in relation to situations and happenings and so forth, as well as of what is heard. Serious falsifications.
Good, thanks. Then that too has been clarified. If now you would read this here, please.
Of course, that's why we also came to your workroom. Reads. Those are good words, and I can understand the motives behind them. I will also hold on to these for myself, because according to our directives, I am not allowed to take them into my possession. However, this one I can take with me, for I have special permission to do so, though I must subject it to a procedure of equalization here in your workroom, but for that I need a small apparatus which I will fetch.
It is no problem. But by equalization, I think you mean neutralization, don't you?
Yes, but I want to do that right away.
Interesting. That just strikes me as when things kept materializing under my nose and falling on the desk. The last time it was an old 200 banknote, and nothing has happened since then. But that does not apply to the computer, because that's where the craziest thing has happened so far. This, of course, over the Pentecost days, although the whole fuss started last Friday when I came into my office in the morning and switched on the computer. No sooner was the screen open than a hardcore sex film was playing on it, which I of course tried to switch off immediately, but I could not, because every time I did, it switched to a different sex film. It was simply not possible to fade out the whole thing, just as it was impossible to simply switch off the computer. So I had no choice but to stall the whole thing by disconnecting the power supply. When I later repowered the computer, the same drama started again and again, with nothing I could do to stop it and get back to work. Members who were in my office and sitting on the sofa, me at the bottom of the desk, witnessed some of it themselves. This because I had switched on the computer again and tried to work, because suddenly hardcore sex films appeared on the screen again, and then suddenly I also had questions addressed directly to me personally from a young woman asking if I could be with her and when and where. Well, you can imagine it. Of course, I also tried to delete this nonsensical offer of sex, but I did not succeed, so I put the mouse away again and sat down at the bottom of the desk. The group member sitting on the sofa, who also saw what was happening on the computer screen without my intervention, asked me several times to delete the outrageous offer. Of course, he also saw that I really was not manipulating anything and did not even have the mouse in my hand, and was also sitting at the bottom of the desk on my armchair. But when I then took the mouse again and wanted to delete the whole thing another time and also switch off the computer again, it was not possible, as it had been all the time before. This is the way it has been since Friday morning through Saturday, Pentecost, and Whit Monday. Towards Monday evening, I was able to write with the computer a letter for someone in Poland. Having already reached the second half of the letter, there was suddenly an insertion of an email address in the existing text at the top. So I called Michael, who was able to open the inserted address, whereupon, of course, hardcore pornography appeared again. How could it be otherwise? So everything was as before, which is why I then asked Ueli, who is a trained computer programmer, if he could help me and put an end to all the terror. Of course, he was helpful as always and tried to put an end to all the unpleasant terror, but even as an expert, he had his difficulties and needed almost an hour before he was able to delete everything from the computer and fix it so that I could work again, and that everything was also deleted and clean again in the computer room over there where all the evil had been stored.
This is very unfortunate, and unfortunately Yanarara and Zafanat Paneak, as well as all those of whom there are many, have not yet found any solutions as to how these sectarian swinging waves of the believers in religion can be combated and rendered ineffective, which not only impair your work so badly, but also cause so much mischief on earth and among all earth humans. This is precisely because these swinging waves, which are created and radiated throughout the earth by all believers in religion, always produce in them, at every opportunity, hatred, discontent, falsehood, desire for revenge and retribution, as well as war, terror and desire to kill, whereby all the efforts of those earth humans who strive for peace, freedom, love, harmony, and justice, and who endeavor to create and spread these values, are as good as almost useless. This is because out of about 12,000 earth humans who are taught peace, freedom, love, harmony, and justice, and the reality as well as their truth of life and all existence, on average, only 2 to 3 make an effort to thoughtfully give the teachings the necessary attention and mindfulness in order to find the way to the true conduct of life.
Unfortunately, nothing can be directed against irrationality and cowardice as well as against religious delusion, because it is up to the individual human being and his or her mind, reason, and intellect to recognize reality and truth and to educate them.
To this I can only answer in such a way as I have learned from my father and from you, and to which I think I am trying to explain the whole thing in the way you are wont to do in your saying, because this corresponds to what is evidently necessary in order to instruct and instruct Earth humans. For in the course of the last few years we have gained very clear knowledge through observation and study that the earthly human teaching methods for the development of mind, reason, and intellect are extremely defective, as is also the case with the teaching methods in regard to morals, cognition, mentality, ethics, and ethos. In this respect, in all these methods of teaching, the profound mistake is made that every instruction of education and teaching is applied in an inadequate manner. Firstly, by not applying the correct and necessary word values, and secondly, by not applying the necessary verbal volumes, normal, soft or loud as the case may be, and thirdly, by not presenting and carrying out the necessary explanations in the necessary details, as you, however, do. Now, as for the values I have mentioned, these mean exactly what you have also interpreted for us, Playaran, and explained in your teachings. What we have adopted and learned from you in this way and continue to teach, and which has brought us better knowledge than what has been handed down to us in this respect, which is not in such a detailed way as you teach. Unfortunately, it was and is also no different with us than with Earth humans. That probably since earliest ancient times, all important teachings have been recorded in verbal form by means of written characters and technical apparatus, and have always been taught in this way up to the present day, but never in the detail and explanatory manner that is peculiar to you. Furthermore, through your teaching areas written for us, we have been able to acquire new knowledge that would never have been possible for us to gain without your tirelessness in your teaching, because these are facts that are only to be found in the unfathomable memory banks of Nocodemion, to which only you, as the most distant recent personality of his billion-year-old line of descendants, have access, which is just as closed to us as it is to every other life form. It was my father Svath who had delved deeply into the ancient annals handed down to us, as before his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, etc., all the way back into the farthest past, whereby great parts of the spiritual teachings have been preserved over all times of millions and billions of years and have always been passed on, but only taught in the narrower circle of the Nocodemian lineage, to which my family lineage belongs. It was also determined early on that the teaching should also be carried out and spread wherever parts of our peoples who are descendants of the Nocodemian line segregate themselves into other systems. And as a result of the fact that already more than 22 million years ago, parts of the peoples of our very distant ancestors reached the Dern universe of our creation, that is to say, the space-time structure in which the Earth also exists, but also the Dal universe of the twin creation, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, was also carried out and spread everywhere there. This was done, and continues to be done, by teachers trained for the purpose, as my father was one, but his task was to teach you, and thus your new personality, from the direct distant descendant line of Nocodemion, and to prepare you for the task ahead. And this task he fulfilled, along with others who taught and prepared for their task, the 6 other elders who had already been active before him on Earth, and who each emerged as the new most distant personalities from the line of Nocodemion, but you are the only most distant descendant and elder's person who is marked by a faint mark on your body, as evidence that your present personality corresponds to the descendant personality of the previous elder's personality. This determination, however, leads back to the level of Arahat Atharsata, because the mark is supposed to prove that your present personality corresponds to the previous personality of the founder, which is supposed to be so because, especially in the Christian world of faith, numerous deceivers have always appeared and fraudulently claimed that they themselves were the reborn previous personality of the founder. But now, dear friend, I will interpret according to your mind the explanations you have given us, if you permit. However, I think you will have to rewrite all the teaching you have written for us, for the group members and all the readers of the conversation reports for the sake of their understanding, Although I think that what you have done for us will also be of importance for all the Figu associates, etc.
Excuse me, because I think you could save yourself a recitation, because if you're just going to repeat what I've written, that takes time, and if I'm going to have to rewrite everything anyway, then it is smarter for me to just rewrite everything from scratch, if you can beam what I've written back to me on the computer. Then I can just copy in what I have written, elaborated and explained for you in this regard at our present point of conversation, and rewrite the whole thing in such a way that it is also understandable to Earthlings.
I can accept your idea and your offer, for your explanations would be more detailed and instructive than if I had to gather everything from memory. Therefore, please copy your own explanations at this point. Just with regard to morality, mentality, cognition, ethics, and ethos, as well as understanding reason, intelligence, intellect, intelligentum, and intelligensane, as you have also given it to us. And I would like to say that your explanations are so instructive with regard to everything that you address with it, as has never been given before in this respect in the earthly science of psychology. The earthly scientists of psychology, etc., want to understand psychology, consciousness, the thought-feeling psychic world, and to share in the knowledge of it. But in truth, their findings are no more than first beginnings with regard to a matter which they have just discovered and are taking the first steps to fathom. They are still like a baby that begins to deal with its surroundings in its very own way and makes the first attempts to perceive something and then to learn to comprehend it. When it begins to examine the whole thing through its playful occupations in the existing contexts, processes it, gains its impressions, and in the course of the first year of life, playfully brings about the first thinking steps that are very enormous for it.
Good. I would like to do that, but then I will have to make various changes and transform, carry out, and explain everything in such a way that it will also suit the Earthlings. So, since we are talking about it now, I will then begin to work everything in, for which, however, it is necessary that I also resort to the doctrine of the Spirit and interpret a few things in this respect, especially with regard to the term Spirit, which is also used in the doctrine of the Spirit and doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life. And exactly to this I think that this term should continue to be used in these doctrinal terms, just as it is in all doctrinal parts in general, although the correct name for spiritual doctrine is namely doctrine of creation energy, and in the case of doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life. Basically, the doctrine of the Spirit should be called doctrine of creation energy. But since the term spirit has been commonplace and effectively ingrained an absolute habit among the human beings of the earth since time immemorial, and is thus a determining term that conveys something to human beings by which they are able to imagine something, I would like to retain the special designation spirit, at least for the teaching, and not deviate from it. But it is nevertheless to be clarified that with regard to the teaching of the Spirit, basically the energy of creation is addressed, whereby, however, with the term spirit, a completely wrong designation is used, with which wrong ideas are connected. So I will have to define and explain various things more precisely, which will possibly take a little longer, which is why I think that I will only work out the explanations and statements in peace and quiet after our conversation, and work them into the correct place.
You can shape that the way you want. But I want to thank you for it anyway.
That's good, so I'll add what you want and elaborate on it, but I will start with the necessary explanations of the term spirit, which will take some time if you...
My time is not limited today.
Good, then I'll start with that, for which, however, I have first picked out something from Wikipedia, and will put it right before my first remarks, in order to then explain some things regarding spirit with a Wikipedia excerpt beforehand, whereby, before I start with the actual remarks and explanations, I also have a few things to say, which will probably create further and new adversaries for me, who will hurl insults and hatred at me from all pipes. And what I have to say in this regard for the time being will be what I follow up my words right here. Consequently, I will then continue our conversation in the conversation report after my interpretations and explanations. Before all interpretations, expositions and explanations, etc., the following must be said. With regard to philosophers, it must be explained that I cannot raise this guild to heaven, but consider them to be rivets and zeros with regard to certain concerns and things in relation to their pathological stupidity as a result of their arrogance. Assertions, findings, hypotheses, and false doctrines, which then has its absolute justification. For it goes back to the philosophers that already since Greek antiquity, and even before assertions, findings, hypotheses, and false doctrines were fantasized, which, as a result of the stupidity of later philosophers and various scientists such as psychology, the philosophically produced nonsense has been handed down to the present day. So the same old assertions, false doctrines, suppositions, and nonsense still exist in these areas today, which have also been expanded. But unfortunately, it does not occur to any of the philosophical and psychological luminaries to search their own brain library thoroughly in order to fathom real reality and its truth. But they do not do this because, on the one hand, they only study and learn by heart the old ignorance that has been handed down to them, as a result of which they cannot gain any new, and moreover necessary and effectively truthful knowledge. On the other hand, in their stupidity and arrogance, they do not even find an impulse within themselves to come to the thought that if real philosophy and psychology want to be studied and learned, it is necessary that, first of all, there is a self-study with regard to investigating themselves in every necessary way of who I am, how I am, what I am. For the fact is that only when this is done and the human being knows himself in every conceivable way as well as possible inside and out, as is so beautifully said, whereby many an earthling thinks he has to shine and lift himself up with this. Although the WHO how-what should basically be a matter of course, especially precisely for philosophers and psychologists, can real knowledge and real understanding be gained in these areas? If I consider certain philosophers and psychologists to be zeros and rivets, then this refers to those incomprehensibles of these guilds who are to be mentioned in terms of their stupidity, and this is also the case when they bear traditionally great names. It is to be explained, however, that the stupidity referred to arises in the relationship, because they have not really educated themselves in the way of understanding and reason, as this would correspond to the matter of that matter, with which they occupy themselves only superficially, but not profoundly, intensively, and exactly enough, which is why they also cannot attain any effective knowledge corresponding to reality and truth. And this is precisely because they have never carried out the inevitable who, how, what principle on themselves, and have therefore never been able to bring it to bear. Exactly this can and may be said, for certainly none of these philosophers and psychologists and natural scientists who are to be denounced ever carried out the who, how, what principle in themselves. Consequently, it was not of the right, and it is also not today, if they called themselves philosophers and psychologists and also call themselves so today. The fact is that all of them have not in any way fathomed the necessary study and learning with regard to their own personality, their own character, and the principle of life that also applies to them and their status as human beings, etc., and consequently have also not worked out the resulting knowledge and values that would enable them to be what they claim to be. Consequently, through their studies they have only acquired old-fashioned hypotheses, false doctrines, and little real knowledge, but none of their own, just as they can only acquire such knowledge with great difficulty. However, they think they are great and important, just as they think they are important when they can name names, hypotheses, false doctrines, or good doctrines, findings and results of old philosophers, psychologists, chemists, researchers, and scientists, and recite their treatises, etc., while they themselves, even as zeros and rivets, cannot do this with regard to themselves because of their lack of knowledge and their inability. And this was very often the case not only in ancient times with philosophers, psychologists, and scientists, but it is also true of the same guilds of today. And so, when I call certain philosophers and psychologists zeros and rivets, I am not insulting their personality and not their integrity as human beings, but only their stupidity in terms of their ignorance, arrogance, and non-education in terms of their intellect and reason. This, however, also only with regard to their non-exercise of the inevitable who, how, what principle of their own personality, and thus the non-fulfillment of their duty as well as with regard to the facts and things they have not learnt concerning everything they should effectively know and understand according to reality and truth, which they imagine they have studied and learnt.
It will be as you have said, because on the one hand, everything corresponds to how it actually is. As we have recognized since you worked out the teaching of Nocodemion for us, which only you can do, because we have no possibility whatsoever of being able to use his memory banks. And what I have to say now, for that I will ask you to just let me talk. Listen and do nothing else but listen. And so now to the following. Since you have been calling up and working out the teaching material of Nocodemion for us since your youth, for more than 70 years now, this has allowed us to recognize many errors in all our old teachings, whereby we have been able to correct, rectify, and completely renew a great many erroneous things. And to this I will once raise my voice and express my deepest thanks to you, especially myself, as well as in the name of our body and all our peoples. For you have done so much for us, Play-Yaran, from your youthful days until today, tirelessly and so immeasurably, that we stand deeply in our thanks for you, which we offer you in all respect, honor, and dignity, and will also do so in a special way, about which, however, I will remain silent today. Edward, friend, excuse me, words fail me. Edward, even though I am several times older than you in years, please, do not say a word about it. You are like such a good and loving second father to me, as was also my father Svath. And when you will be gone, I will miss you as I still miss him too, despite the years that have passed since he left and I. Well, I want to speak of something else, and that is that it was only through the work you did for us, Play-Yaran, from early youth, and even more so when you began your mission openly and have since made so much of the teaching of Nocodemion to an extremely extensive degree, that the whole thing finally made all our peoples realize what wrong ways we had gone. It was only through your untiring expositions from the teaching of Nocodemion that we also learned to understand the interrelationships of the real facts of reality and their truth, through which it became possible for us to correct much of what was wrong and also to reshape our attitudes, morals, ethics, and our entire modes of action and behavior in a good, positive, and evolutionary way. Through the teaching of Nocodemion, which is indeed your teaching in the correct manner of his distant line of descendants, we Play-Yaran have changed, rethought, learnt much, and thereby gained a new future through the teaching you have mentioned. Through the work you have tirelessly done for us since your youth, you have helped all our peoples to progress and make positive changes. And through this, we are able to continue our efforts of our entire mental development in a progressive way, which had found a new beginning through our ancestors more than 52,000 years ago in the earthly calendar, but which only through your untiring work for us, Play-Yaran, now brings all that which makes us true human beings, as you often like to say. But we cannot and must not lose this any more, which is why we remain in our efforts in this regard and continue to learn.
You shame me, my friend, because, well, I mean, no, let's not talk about that, because there are other things I want to talk about now. But, well, I just want to say that I was not prepared for what you were talking about just now, which I think can certainly stay between us, can it? But I also do not want to forget to thank you and everyone else for your thanks. Although I feel really ashamed on the one hand because I am not eager to be thanked, and on the other hand because everything you have said seems like praise to me, which I do not want to hear. Moreover, I appreciate the whole thing because with you the teaching of Nocodemion bears good fruit, while here the earthlings do not care about it, but rebel against it and make terror. Unfortunately, there are only a few who have found the way through understanding and reason, and will probably continue to do so, which is very gratifying. However, this does not guarantee that in the foreseeable future the religions and fanatical delusions of God that cause all evil, negative and bad things, wars and terror, as well as the insane further growth of the overpopulation that destroys everything, will come to an end. It will take a long time and a lot of work by Figu and its core group members, passive members and fellow Phi-Gu members before a great success will come. Unfortunately, it is also the case that many human beings who actually use the Phi-Gu mission teachings in relation to their own personalities learn and also make an effort to personally implement what they have learned. Do not dare to also pass on and spread everything to the outside world.
This, unfortunately, is as much in accordance with the fact as it is that betrayal of the teaching and of your work is practiced by members who first learn earnestly and strive sternly. But who then, out of thoughtless private airs and foolishness, as you sometimes say, shamefully turn away from everything, betraying the teaching and thus themselves?
These human beings betray themselves because, in spite of all their learning, they have not really learned, but have simply followed or are following along, as a result of which they also have no confidence in themselves, thus do not trust themselves, but betray themselves to themselves, and do themselves evolutionary harm. These human beings are also dissatisfied within themselves. They also have no correct purpose in life, and therefore occupy themselves on the one hand only with worldly things that are unsatisfactory to them, but on the other hand also with illusory values and self-beliefs or forms of faith accepted from outside. Now, however, I want to address what you asked me to address, precisely what I was allowed to pass on to you as teaching from the memory bank of Nokodemion, whereby I also said that some things must be addressed which I have picked out as an excerpt from Wikipedia with regard to spirit, and will insert beforehand into what is now to be explained. See here, this is what I have addressed.